Hello all, I'm Kel Kidman. Welcome to Breaking On the Daily, where today we begin with a study from the New York Times that finds that masks do not protect wearers, but you need to wear them anyway. Now, here's the thing about this study. This study is very interesting. It shows, it completely confirms that wearing a mask is not going to prevent you from getting the disease, something which has been a favorite talking point of misinformed leftists of the past few months with regard to COVID. But it has nothing to say with regard to whether you wearing a mask will prevent you from spreading to other people. Because what it shows, its methodology, is prohibitive on that front. Essentially what they did is they got a group of people, they said, you guys wear masks, you guys don't wear masks, go. And then after a month, the same amount of people got infected with COVID. Essentially, statistically insignificant differences aside, they said essentially the same amount of people got infected for statistical purposes. There was a slight increase for people who did not wear masks. It was 2.1 as opposed to 1.8%. But they said it was statistically insignificant, and I'm there to trust them. I am not an expert on statistics, and thus, I'll defer to people who know more than me on this front, especially when it helps my point. But I find this study interesting because I think you could theoretically do a meta-analysis to determine whether you could, it would affect spread the other way as well. Like, you could make an analysis about it with regard to, like, the location they're in and what the percentage of mask wearing in that location is. Like, if you had that data and then you could extrapolate on that, then it would potentially be interesting to prove maybe the opposite point, though that's not what they did. Their methodology and how they analyzed the data did not include that sort of analysis. And so they didn't, say anything about whether it could prevent transmission from someone who has the disease to someone who doesn't. Though I'd find it interesting to see if they could do an analysis on that as well. Yeah, it's an interesting study. It's kind of what you expect. I mean, we had something that people miss is that in the past we've done studies on whether masks can prevent airborne virus spread. I mean, back in 1919, after the Spanish flu, as I'm fond of saying, there was a study in California, I believe it was, that because in certain places in California, they actually had mandated masks before. And what the study was there to do was to determine whether it had helped prevent the disease at all, like whether it prevented disease transmission at all. And they determined that it didn't. That it was essentially worthless, that it didn't do anything. And, we like to pretend that no scientific study has been done since before the 90s, but that's not true. They've been doing scientific study for centuries, really. I mean, and a lot of these studies are still accurate because their methodologies aren't bad. A lot of the studies that do similar methodologies find the same results, and all of the studies that we're talking about now that support the use of masks are either very controlled clinical trials that do not represent what's happening in terms of, like, your natural, normal, day-to-day life, or you're talking about studies in which it's essentially a computer model, which, if you know anything about computer models or how they operate, aren't scientific. They're pseudoscientific nonsense. I mean, they're essentially glorified hypotheses. To go into more detail, when you're talking about a computer model, it goes counter to what the scientific method is, because the scientific method is inherently designed to study the natural world. But if you're talking about a computer model, you're not studying the natural world. Why?
Method steps in
Why?
Order, according to...
Okay. Anyway, back to the discussion that we were talking about. The scientific method, it requires the study of the natural world. That's what it requires. It needs that in order to do anything. But a computer model, when you're studying a computer, or a model that you created on the computer, you're not studying the natural world. You're not studying science in that sense. And so, putting your hat on computer models it's never going to work. I mean, you just have so many factors that you couldn't possibly take into account. But there's more stories that we have today, and man, this has been a roller coaster, because you remember yesterday where I gave you the story of the Wayne County GOP board members saying that we aren't going to certify the results, and then saying, okay, we'll certify the results if there's an audit, after they got harassed and harangued and apparently threatened, like had their physical safety threatened by the Democrats, and were doxxed and all that sort of thing. Well, essentially, now they want to rescind their votes, because the Michigan Secretary of State, they essentially, the reason they said, okay, we'll do it, is they did it on the pretense that there would be an audit of the results, but the Michigan Secretary of State said, I don't know, we might not do an audit. So now they're like, okay, so we're not certifying the results then, okay? We want to rescind our votes now. And, that's kind of, this is really an interesting story to see where it goes, because they have sworn affidavits now that said that they had been pressured, and that saying they had been improperly pressured, and said that essentially they were like threatened and such in order to certify the results. And it's interesting because this might end up going to court. I mean, over whether they can actually rescind their votes, or whether that agreement they had come to with regard to the audit was legally binding at all. It'll be interesting. It'll be interesting. The one of them said they felt misled about whether there would be an audit or not, and he said Palmer said he wouldn't. He stands firm in not certifying the Wayne County without an audit. So that's good. Yeah. So this has been a roller coaster, just an absolute. What's going on, man? So, man, and that's not even all for doxing stories. A Trump campaign lawyer is now under protection following threats of harm. So, wow, if you thought the Democrats were confident and they're winning, might I say, no, they're not. People who are confident do not threaten people who are looking into potential wrongdoing. Like, people who are confident in an election do not do this sort of thing. Okay, people who are confident they won't find anything don't do this sort of thing. I mean, it's similar to kind of the Jeffrey Epstein thing, where, Jeffrey Epstein did not kill himself. People don't kill people like Jeffrey Epstein if they don't think that there's something to be found about them. And I think there's a similar thing going on, not to the same degree. Obviously no one's been killed yet, but it's pretty clear, I think, at this point, that a lot of these Democrat operatives are scared. They're scared something's going to happen, because if there was nothing to find, there would be no problem with an audit. And people say, oh, but that's just the privacy argument. No, it's not. Because here's the thing: what right does an election have to privacy? It doesn't have a right to privacy. Elections are supposed to be open. They're supposed to be free. They're supposed to be transparent. If an election is not transparent, if they don't have the requisite transparency in order to, be a proper election, which it's fairly clear at this point, this election is not. It needs to be more transparent. There needs to be more, audits, more investigations, more everything. Because the election doesn't have a right to privacy. An individual does. So if there's nothing to hide in this function of democracy that is supposed to be transparent, why are you so against an investigation? Why are you so against it? Because you think it wastes money? We waste money all the time, and this is much more useful of a use of money than anything else the government is doing. Pretty much at this point, most things at least. Pretty much you have federal law enforcement, certain amount of military spending. That's about it in terms of more useful than this, in terms of government spending. But it's just clear that they don't want any of this investigated. Because here's an interesting, I think it's an op-ed from the Federalist. In Nevada, a corrupt cashier vote scheme is hiding in plain sight. So this is insane. This is an insane story. Essentially, these native lands in Nevada were doing an get out the vote campaign, where they were giving out cash prizes, doing raffles, and all this sort of stuff. And it wasn't just like, oh, get out the vote, period, because that, though it would be illegal anyway because of how the voter code actually works, they also have people in Biden-Harris regalia standing around in this, doing this, like giving out cash prizes while they're freaking wearing the regalia, promoting this sort of thing. This is bad. This is bad. This is a violation of federal law. Like, does this not deserve to be investigated? Does this not? Can we not say, is this happening anywhere else? Can we see if this is happening? No, of course. There's nothing to be investigated. Why are you asking for transparency? Jeez. But yeah, just in case, another thing that was claimed to not need investigations over the past few months, the Hunter Biden story has resurged. Senate investigators, new records confirm troubling Biden family links to China and Russia. So yeah, the Hunter Biden story, which everyone said was a conspiracy theory and had no basis in reality, now we have a Senate investigation saying, yeah, that's real. Oh, because the laptop wasn't enough. Because all of these people coming out. Tony Bobolinsky wasn't enough. Now we need the Senate investigation coming out saying, yeah, this is all real. As if you need it anymore. I mean, it confirms the Chinese links. It confirms the Russia links, the 3.5 million they got from the Moscow mayor's wife. They confirmed all of that. They confirmed all of it. Everything in the Biden story, the Hunter Biden story, was real. All of the worrying financial links, all of the corrupt dealings were all confirmed to be real. And here's the interesting thing. Earlier on in the week, we found out that Hunter Biden still has stakes in China. And I think in Russia as well. I know in China. So these guys are corrupt. Biden's corrupt. Alright? Biden is corrupt. You know, and it's funny because Biden said that he wouldn't allow his family to do any financial dealings in other countries if he had won the presidency. So there's only two options now. Either he's corrupt, which, yeah, obviously, or he doesn't think he's won presidency. Oh, man. It just is frustrating to see how this story I've been covering since this show began has been confirmed to be real. But there will still be people who will say, oh, no, it's a conspiracy theory. And it's insane that this continues to happen. On to other stories. We have a financial story now. Japan Inc. to begin experiments issuing digital yen. This is interesting because a lot of countries have been promoting cashless payments, the sort of debit, credit sort of stuff. I mean, this includes the U.S. The U.S. is at like 45% cashless payments at this point. I'm no better in this respect. I do a lot of cashless payments myself, though I also am in cryptocurrency as well. And China's kind of insane. They're up at 70%, but Japan's only down at 20% because their people are sane and actually like to own things and own physical things. So there are three mega banks essentially are saying, okay, we're going to create a system through which we can do these sort of cashless payments, the sort of Google Pay type thing, the digital currency sort of stuff. This is an interesting story. I mean, the sort of cashless thing is interesting because it's coming out around the same time as you have the sort of DeFi, cryptocurrency stuff. And it's interesting because one of the two is going to win out. I'm personally of the opinion that eventually cryptocurrencies will win out as opposed to the sort of traditional cashless payments that we're doing right now. Over time, I mean, it's slowly getting there. I mean, and you need to have these sort of more... It needs to gain stability. I mean, if you look at Bitcoin specifically, it's all over the place all the time. It is the digital gold, you know, and that's sort of what it's being treated like at this point. And that's what a lot of cryptocurrencies are being treated like. They're treated more like stocks than they are an actual currency through which you buy things, at least in large respects. And I think that's one of the problems that needs to be solved in cryptocurrency, is you need to solve the problem of you don't have a lot of people doing, the sort of things you want them to be doing with it. It's not being treated like a currency, it's being treated like an asset, like a stock, rather than, like the US dollar. And I think that needs to be fixed in the cryptocurrency market, and I think it's a problem that can be solved. I mean, you have stable currencies and things like that. USDC is one of the ones that comes to mind, of one that, cryptocurrencies that tie their value to something that already exists in real life. Though I don't know if that's the perfect solution. I'm not hugely into cryptocurrencies, though they do interest me. So that's kind of my assessment of the scenario. But on to our last story, and this one's just a funny one. I mean, and a marketable one, because I'm fairly sure that most people are going to be talking about this today. This is an article, an op-ed from the New York Times, saying, "We talked to Trump supporters. They said, I tried. I gave up." This story is so condescending. It is so condescending. Just to say, let's go through a few of the things. So, I wanted to talk to the people the media calls real Americans from the heartland, which of course is America's synonym for white people, Trump's most fervent base. This is so silly. I mean, the progressive attitudes he has throughout this article is clear. His terminology is all about how when people say hard work, they mean whiteness. Or when people try to remove out of the crappy Democrat-run inner cities, they're getting away from blackness. That's what their idea is. Because he talks in such condescending ways. He talks about how I talked to them about multiculturalism and progressive values, and they didn't immediately change their positions, flip their positions around. And so, no. Oh, man. And he's like, I give up. Now we're just going to try and censor it. And his solutions are insane. So, he starts throughout the majority of the article just, condescending to people, talking about how things like, chaos, people talking about chaos in the suburbs, things like the McCloskey's incident, saying they illegally brandished firearms when they didn't, saying the protesters that broke down a gate in order to get into the private property that was the community that the McCloskeys lived in, he called them peaceful, which is just objectively false. They didn't illegally brandish their firearms. It was legal. They were on their property. The state they were in, St. Louis, Louisiana, has very strong stand your ground laws that allow them to stand on their property and brandish firearms at people who are illegally trespassing, which is what those protesters were doing. And he says that chaos, he says it's a dog whistle for people of color. It's clear this guy's just a prick. And at a certain point in the article, it was clear because he compares himself to a cardiologist when he says, when one of these guys says, yeah, I don't like Trump's tone, but I don't think he's a racist. I don't think in his heart, what he thinks, I don't think he thinks he's a racist. And he's like, well, I'm not a cardiologist, so I can't comment on that. It made clear to me that, yeah, this guy's just a prick. I can see why he didn't convince anyone. He clearly is not interested in actually speaking to any of these people, because something that he obviously missed is that he doesn't speak the same language that these people speak. And you might say, Kelton, you said they're all speaking English. How could they be speaking different languages? Simple. They're all using different definitions of the same words. When he says whiteness, he means things like meritocracy, capitalism, everything that could potentially be considered good in the world from a traditional morality standpoint. When he says blackness, he means laziness and all these sorts of other things. Communism and just all these sort of ridiculous leftist dogma. That's what he means when he says blackness. He means people who live in the inner city. He means ideological standpoints. That's what he means. It's clear from the article. Now, to be clear, that's not what I mean when I say things like black or white. I am not a racist. This guy clearly is. But that's what he means. And when these people say things like meritocracy, or they say things like chaos in the suburbs. They're referring to meritocracy and chaos in the suburbs. They're not referring to whiteness or people of color. But this guy thinks they are because he thinks that everyone is as racist as he is. He's a racial socialist, and much in the same vein as someone like Adolf Hitler. And for those who would question the comparison, there's something that always needs to be asked of these sort of progressive ideologues, these progressive racial socialists, and that is, what is the final solution to the white question? I mean, you have to ask them the question. If you're intent on socializing the whiteness out of the people, what about the white people? You know, if you're trying to socialize the whiteness out of the people, well, is your plan eventually to get rid of the white people, whether that be through, deportation, internment camps? What is your inevitable plan? I'm not saying that's what they're saying. But it's a question that has to be asked of their ideology, because it is a question that their ideology poses. And that's something that a lot of people miss when they're thinking about their own ideologies, is that your own perspective, your own worldview, it poses questions. And if you don't think about those questions and what they mean and what the answers to those questions are, you're never going to actually have a full understanding of what your positions are, and you'll never be able to actually convince anyone of anything. And I'm not convinced this person has not thought of these questions. I mean, it's an inevitable byproduct of his thought, of his train of thought. This guy, and it's clear as well through what his solutions are, that he is not only for removing whiteness from the society, but he says, quote, "One step would be to continue pressuring social media giants like Twitter and Facebook to deplatform hate mongers, such as Steve Bannon, and censor disinformation. It's not enough, but it's a start." He's pro removing people he doesn't like from the society. He is an authoritarian. He's anti-free speech, clearly. And that is his core motivation throughout for this article. And he's like, you know what? I give up. I'm not going to try and convince you. Let's go to the gulag. Because he says it's not enough. And the funny thing about that link is, this link, it shows some ridiculous measures that he thinks should go into place. He's anti-free speech. He's anti-First Amendment. He's anti-Second Amendment, because he talks about how, people trying to take away your guns is a conspiracy theory. Well, it clearly isn't. This guy is dangerous. This guy is a prick. He's a moron. And he needs to be... He doesn't need to be removed from society, because I believe in free speech. I believe that people have a right to speak freely and speak what they believe. But he shouldn't be listened to. Okay? You shouldn't speak to him, and that's why this article specifically is archived, alright? I would never put up this article in a non-archive format. Most of the time, I only do archive because I think because it saves space on the URL. That's why I do it, or because of a subscription blockade. But in this case, it's because this guy's a prick. He doesn't deserve clicks. Alright, so if you're going to be sharing the story, do not share it without an archived link. Alright? The link to archives, it's in the description. I suggest you read the article, because this guy's viewpoint is necessary to understand in order to know what you're fighting against. Alright? It's just as important to understand who you are as it is who you are fighting against. And in this case, you have to read it. You have to read this article. Alright? And it's going to infuriate you. It is. Because this guy's speaking in a completely different language than you. And it's evident through every single word he said. But you need to read it. And you need to understand what he's saying and what he means by what he says. Because this guy's your enemy. This guy's the guy who you're going to be going up against in the next few years. And exactly the type of person I want to fight against in terms of my political speaking, in terms of my political commentary. He is most of the reason I'm doing this. Alright? So I suggest you read it. Read it, of course, archived. Do not read this on the New York Times. It does not deserve your claim. But read it. And that's where I'm going to leave you today. This has been Breaking on the Daily. I'm Kel Kidman, and I'm out.